The Great Hammers is one of the better weapon classes in Elden Ring. These are very large, hard-hitting strength weapons, get some decent range, decent damage. Their movesets offer some nice variety, and their movesets aren't really that slow either. They're very comparable to the Great Axes, but the difference is that the Great Axes will have more damage, but the Great Hammers actually get more stance damage, and they also offer striking damage as well, which there are a lot more enemies weaker to striking damage compared to standard damage. So on average, I might just gravitate more towards the Great Hammers, especially because if you're stance breaking quicker, you're more likely than not going to be doing some more damage as well. And these weapons can offer almost just as much stance damage as colossal weapons, but they're actually going to be considerably faster. They also do offer a bit more hype armor as well. So if you actually did want to go with a hard-hitting strength type of weapon, I honestly recommend going with the Great Hammers because they're very easy to use and they do almost everything really well. Now there are 16 Great Hammers in total, and unfortunately a lot are not that unique. Basically every single one of these things offer the exact same moveset, and the only real difference between some of these weapons might just be the scalings and the range. Would have been nice if there were some more unique types of movesets, but they're still a very good weapon class. But as always, this ranking is based on how useful the weapons are inside of PvE. Starting off at the bottom, the Celebrant's Skull. Now, just like all the Celebrant weapons, they all can be infused, but they just get bad range and really bad damage. But their trade-off being is that they can get runes upon hit, and for the Celebrant Skull, it's only 20 runes for every single hit, which is just useless. Even if this thing was like 200 runes per hit, I still wouldn't find much value in it. But thankfully, unlike the other Celebrant weapons, you don't have to farm for it, which is pretty nice. And it also does tie for the lowest end weight and have the lowest strength requirements out of all of the infusible Great Hammers. But the thing is, it's not that much lower to warrant me wanting to use it over some other options. Like for the large club, it basically weighs the exact same. The requirements are only a little bit higher, but it gets much more range, much more damage, and you can acquire it right at the beginning of the game. So this weapon is practically useless. Number 15, the DEVOURER'S Scepter. Now, this Great Hammer does actually have the most range in class. Now, the trade-off being is that it does actually consume a lot more stamina than the other Great Hammers. However, the weapon does actually get some pretty decent scalings, as seen in all strength, dexterity, and faith. Now, the thing is that total overall damage is not going to be that high still. Like a Flame Art infused Great Hammer could just perform better, and the Cranial Vessel Candlestand, even with unoptimized stats, can just outdamage the Devourer's Scepter still. But the main reason why it's going to get into the D tier is because of its skill. Devourer of the Worlds is one of the worst unique skills in the entire game. This thing is an absolute monstrosity, and I don't understand how this thing has never gotten buffed a single time. It does perform as a small ranged fire-based AoE attack. The skill gets no hype armor, consumes 35 FP, consumes a whole bunch of stamina, does next to no damage, but the trade-off is that you actually heal yourself for a little bit, but the healing effect is so small to the point where it's just not really worth using at all. Now, it actually does gain a bit more effect the more enemies that you hit with the skill, but the chances of you hitting multiple enemies with a very short range attack that doesn't have any hype armor with this long of an animation, it's just not worth using at all. There are plenty of other like health regen based sources in this game that can just perform way better than something like this. And it's such a shame because this is a legendary weapon and it looks really cool. Like this thing should be one of the best weapons in the game. It should be comparable to the Blasphemous Blade, which works very similar. That weapon skill also heals for basically just as much, but obviously it goes way further, has hype armor, way more damage. And the funny thing is the Blasphemous Blade skill consumes less FP as well. Number 14, the Battle Hammer, which is definitely one of the most disappointing weapons in the entire game. This Great Hammer gets some of the worst damage in class, and it also gets the worst range too. And the funny thing is, it doesn't even compensate for this really bad range or really bad damage, doesn't consume like any less stamina, doesn't really weigh that much less either. The weapon just has basically nothing going for it, and you have to farm for it too, which is just ridiculous because they actually changed it to where it was a guaranteed drop, but now it's not, and the Rotten version is still a guaranteed drop. I don't know why it didn't come with like some cool unique power sensing combo, like what the duelists actually do have. They have it connected to a cool chain, and they throw the weapon out, have it return to them, but when we get the weapon, it's just a basic generic Great Hammer. This is such a missed opportunity. My dream of having like a cool chain-based weapon that you can throw out and have it return to you has been like teased throughout this entire game with so many different types of weapons, and it just never came to fruition in this game. Hopefully it's something that can implement into the next game with like a brand new engine, but yes, this thing has always been and always will be just a massive disappointment. Number 13, the GREATHORN Hammer. Now, this is an infusible Great Hammer, does get average range and average damage. You do have to farm for this thing as well. And the only use that it does have is that it gives you 3% health back for every single kill, which definitely isn't much, but it obviously is still a positive. But is it that much more of a positive to warrant me wanting to use this thing over the other Great Hammers that get more range and more damage? Probably not. Now, the good thing is that you don't even need to actually kill with the weapon directly for you to actually benefit off this health regen, so it could serve potentially as a nice offhand option. but the Serpent God's Curved Sword probably already has that covered. It gives you basically just as much health back, and it's going to be a much lighter. Now it can stack alongside with that, but I still wouldn't really bother, because if you did want to have some health regen, I'd just use something like the Great Stars. This weapon basically gets just as much damage, but it gives you 1% HP for every single hit, which I much prefer, and that thing gets bleed as well, and you don't have to farm for it. So yeah, this thing is just directly outclassed. Number 12, the Rotten Battle Hammer. Now this is the lowest damaging Great Hammer in the entire game with every single infusion. It just performs the worst in terms of damage, and as I mentioned with the regular Battle Hammer, it also gets the worst range in class 2 with like no other benefits. It definitely should have been some like cool, unique power stancing type of weapon that actually offered like a unique moveset as well, just like what the duelists offer. But no, instead we just get this complete waste of a really cool looking weapon. Now the reason why I'm going to value the Rotten version over the regular Battle Hammer despite it getting less damage is the fact that it does come with passive rot, and Scarlet Rot is very powerful. Once it is procced, it does do about 15% damage over that 90 seconds, but the thing is, you're not going to really proc it that quickly with a Great Hammer, and even if you do, it's still not worth it, because I would just rather go with another Great Hammer that just gets more range and more damage. And even if you compensate for actually proccing rot on an enemy, those weapons are still going to get more damage. Like I've used this thing against many different types of bosses like Radagon, and I literally killed him before I could even proc the Scarlet Rot. So in that instance, I'd rather just go with the weapon that just gets more damage. Number 11, the Large Club. Now this is not a bad weapon by any means. In fact, this thing actually does offer the most range out of all the infusible Great Hammers, and it also is the lightest, which is really nice. Now the trade-off being is that it does get some of the worst damage out of all the Great Hammers, and the range isn't that much more, and the weight isn't that much lighter to warrant me wanting to use it over the other Great Hammers. I could just put a couple more points into strength and just benefit of a much higher damaging weapon, but the Large Club can be acquired earlier than all the other ones, doesn't require any farming, don't have to kill anything for it, you can just pick it up, and you get a very decent weapon. But outside of that, I'd just go in a different direction. Number 10, the SMITHSCRIPT Great Hammer, which is an infusible Great Hammer, does actually offer some of the most range in class, does get scalings in almost every stat but Arcane. So at these really high amounts of levels, it actually can be the highest damaging one. Now it doesn't really get as much range as a lot of the other Great Hammers, which is unfortunate, but it actually does get a projectile heavy attack just like all the other SMITHSCRIPT weapons, which is both like the best and the worst thing about the weapon itself. Like all of these SMITHSCRIPT weapons should just easily be S tier options, but From Software were just way too careful with these things, and they just have way too many downsides for me to actually want to use them. Now the SMITHSCRIPT Great Hammer actually does get a little bit of a spin to win before actually releasing and throwing the hammer with its heavy attack, and at these closer ranges it actually can do some nice damage and some nice stance damage, and if you are using status effects it actually can proc them pretty quickly too. Now the unfortunate part about them, it has a really long animation, it gets less stance damage than a regular charged heavy attack that the Great Hammers have, and it consumes so much stamina as well. So in most cases you would only want to use this thing at a distance, and if you're just using it at a distance, it does not perform well at all. The damage is not good, the stance damage is terrible, it still consumes a lot of stamina, and like the worst thing about these SMITHSCRIPT weapons is that you can't really even spec into like a charged heavy attack build to make them better. You can't equip things like Crag Blade or Royal Knight Resolve. You can't even use weapon buffs like Flaming Strike, Chilling Mist. You can't even buff this weapon with like regular grease. So in almost every single instance, I'd just rather have a regular normal Great Hammer to use. And there are plenty of like really cheap projectile options in this game. Now you can argue that a lot of the really cheap and good projectile Ashes of War can't be equipped onto Great Hammers, so this could have some nice utility there. But the damage is that poor that I don't really see it worth it that much. And with these strength type of builds, you have access to a lot of different type of projectile options anyway. Number 9, the ENVOY'S Longhorn. Now before the DLC and patch 1.12, I considered this weapon to be the best Great Hammer in the game and the best holy damaging weapon too, but unfortunately it got nerfed really hard to the point where I don't really value it as much. Now the weapon still gets some really nice scalings with a Faith type of build. It still might not outdamage things like the Cranial Vessel Candlestand, nor get as much range, and obviously a fire damage is probably just a better damage type compared to Holy, unless you are taking it into the DLC. But the best part about this weapon was its skill Bubble Shower, which for 16 FP just fired out a whole bunch of these bubbles, and they just used to do like insane amounts of damage, especially against larger bosses, and just did really good stance damage too. But now after the patch, it's basically like got its damage cut in half, and its stance damage cut in half too. Like this thing used to be very decent against even small enemies, but now at this point it's like borderline useless. Now against large bosses where it was like really overpowered, it's okay to use. I still would use the skill a whole bunch if I did have the weapon equipped and I'm fighting these larger bosses like dragons and whatnot, but it's just not going to melt anywhere near as hard. And I used to be able to get like 60 or even 70 stance damage consistently against these larger bosses with this skill, but now I'm not even getting 30 stance damage. Now still is a pretty cheap skill at only 16 FP, but the thing is, the ENVOY'S Greathorn now just directly outclasses it. Before the patch, the ENVOY'S Greathorn was really good to use, but the ENVOY'S Longhorn just had the better version of a skill, but now it's the other way around. ENVOY'S Greathorn just goes further, gets tracking, explodes in a large AoE, does more damage, more stance damage. Like, that skill is just better across the board. Because the Envoy's Longhorn has like dramatic damage fall off, and at these further distances, it kind of just sucks. Where the Envoy's Greathorn skill doesn't really have that as a downside. Now, I do like Great Hammers better than Colossal Weapons, and the Envoy's Longhorn does get better scalings than the Envoy's Greathorn, so it's not completely useless, but it definitely got nerfed too hard in my opinion. Number 8, the Black Steel Great Hammer. Now, if you actually wanted to deflect or guard counter with a Faith type of build, this is going to be the option for you. But if you didn't really care to do deflecting or guard countering, I wouldn't really care to use this thing at all. Now, it does actually get the most amount of damage with a Sacred Infusion, and it also does get some bonus damage when you actually use holy types of buffs. But the thing is, if I were to go with a Faith build, you are going to utilize both Flame Art and Sacred, and with a Flame Art Infusion, you are going to get some more damage out of the other Great Hammers. And if you're going to be playing through the base game, you're going to be like on a Flame Art Infusion almost all the time. Now, it probably still does perform the best in terms of a guard countering or a deflecting type of build, because it actually does leave a cool AoE after Shockwave effect. And if the entire combo does hit, then you're actually going to get the most stance damage and probably even the most damage out of all the Great Hammers with these guard counters. Now, the unfortunate part about the weapon is that if you miss with the AoE, you're actually doing less stance damage and definitely doing less damage compared to all the other Great Hammers with the guard counter. Because for some reason, like the motion values for the guard counter of this weapon are just lower than the rest. Because there are plenty of times where like maybe the AoE just misses, and then in that instance, you'd literally have the worst guard countering weapon. So I kind of wish this thing did get changed to where like the guard counter stance damage and damage was the same as all the other Great Hammers, and the AoE was just a bonus. And I kind of wish that the AoE effect did a bit more damage too. Like the AoE Shockwave doesn't scale off things like the Deflect Talisman or the Curve Sword Talisman, and it just scales off Faith. So it does have the potential to be a lot better, but it still is a very solid guard countering option, and Great Hammers already get a good guard counter, as they're pretty quick and do get some nice hyper armor. But it definitely isn't the best thing in my opinion. Number 7, the Great Mace. Now, if I'm going with a pure strength type of build using a Great Hammer, which typically is the optimal option, I would honestly go with a Great Mace, because at these higher levels of strength, it gets like the second highest damage. It's like just below the Brick Hammer with a strength type of build. But the reason why I might prefer it a bit more than the Brick Hammer in terms of these strength type of builds is because it does get a lot more range. There are so many times where I use the Brick Hammer and it just always end up falling a bit short. And if you were noticing that yourself, I would just go with the Great Mace. It gets good damage, it gets good range, you don't have to farm for it, it looks really cool. Now, I'm still not going to really value it as much as the Greats does, because that weapon does get bleed and health regen, and I think that just like takes it over the top to be the better strength option in my opinion. And if you did just want raw damage, the Brick Hammer still is going to be better. And there are other Great Hammers out there that can just get more range as well. So albeit it is a very solid and good reliable weapon, I'm probably not going to like it as much as some of the other options. As number 6, the Brick Hammer. Now, this weapon is the highest damaging infusible Great Hammer in the entire game. Every single infusion, basically the Brick Hammer just comes out on top. Now, it actually does get some of the lowest base damage, so at these lower levels, it's probably not going to perform as well. But once you do get a bit later on, this one just becomes the hardest hitting. So if damage was the only thing that really mattered to you, I will just use the Brick Hammer. Now, I'm still not going to really value it as much as some of the other options, and it's mainly because of its range. Like, this thing does get some of the worst range in class, and it is very noticeable as well. There are plenty of times where I just end up coming short with this weapon, whether I'm just using like the regular moveset or using weapon skills. The range is definitely a problem, and it actually does tie for the heaviest Great Hammer as well, which I am perfectly okay with, because in return, it actually does get some of the best blocking compared to all the other Great Hammers. So if you did want to go with a guard countering build, the Brick Hammer could be your best option too. And with a lot of cases with guard counters, range doesn't really make much of a difference. So the Brick Hammer might just be the best options for those type of builds. But the main reason why it's not going to get into the S tier is because there are better infusible Great Hammers in my opinion. Things like the Pickaxe can just do very similar damage, but just get more range and get piercing damage. So it is arguably going to be even better with guard counters, and it's probably end up getting more total overall damage as well because of counter hits. But this weapon can be acquired right at the beginning of the game, don't have to farm for it, and it can carry from start to finish with great ease. Number 5, the Curved Great Club. Now, this is just a very basic and generic Great Hammer. It does get some of the most damage, and it does get some of the most range. It can be infused, doesn't really weigh that much, doesn't really have that high of a requirement, and it actually does get some of the highest base damage, so it actually can be the best early game option for the Great Hammers, and it might end up performing the best with these elemental builds as well, because typically these higher base damages just mean more damage with the other elemental infusions, and it also just means you're getting a lot more damage on your critical attacks as well, which Great Hammers obviously just get amazing stance damage. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to get as much damage as the Brick Hammer, and you do have to farm for it, but I am still going to value it more because it does get a lot more range, and earlier on in the game, it can just be better as well. But once again, as I did mention, if range isn't that big of a deal for you, or if you wanted to go with guard counters, I think the Brick Hammer is better. Number 4, the BEASTCLAW Great Hammer, which in my opinion is one of the more underrated weapons in this game. It does only get average range and average damage. It is a weapon that cannot be infused, does get some split holy damage, unfortunately only gets a D scaling and faith while having C scalings in both strength and dexterity. I kind of wish it was a more strength faith type of weapon and not really just a quality one, but that's still perfectly fine because the weapon has plenty of upsides going for it. And that's number 1, it just gets the most damage with charged heavy attacks. For some reason this thing just gets higher motion values with its heavy attacks, and it's to the point that it can get just as much damage as a colossal weapon with its charged heavy. And also for some reason it just consumes less stamina, and that's not just with the charged heavy attack but just across the board. It just consumes less stamina than all the other great hammers. So as a weapon itself it's really good, but the best part about it is probably still going to be its skill. Regal BEASTCLAW for only 20 FP shoots out a bunch of these claw-based attacks. The weapon does just do pure physical damage, and it actually does scale off AR, so you don't have to go into a particular stat just to benefit. It also gets some nice hyper armor and actually does 28 stance damage, which is very nice. Now this thing does not go that far by any means, so if you are going to treat this thing like a blasphemous blade projectile or even like a vacuum slice type of projectile, it's not going to really work that way. But the major benefits obviously is that it does it in a nice horizontal spread. So if you're fighting multiple enemies at once or fighting enemies like to dodge and move around, this thing is going to hit them almost every single time. It also isn't going to be like the fastest animation in the world. It's probably going to be a little bit risky, but in that instance you could just use the charged heavy attacks or the regular heavy attacks because as I mentioned they just do bonus damage. So yeah, if you haven't already used the BEASTCLAW Great Hammer, I recommend that you do. I would have liked to put it into the S tier, but unfortunately the scalings aren't really that good, and I kind of wish it got some piercing damage as well. Like the weapon has a whole bunch of claws coming out the end of it, but it just does regular striking damage. So if it had those two things, I probably would have thrown it into the S tier, but it still is deserving of a very high A tier. Number 3, the Cranial Vessel Candlestand, which is a very solid strength faith-based weapon. Does get a B scaling in both, and the AR can just be ridiculously high. It actually does tie for the heaviest great hammer in the game, but it actually does get some of the most range too. And now unfortunately, just like the DEVOURER'S SCEPTER, it actually does consume more stamina with every single one of its attacks. But unlike the DEVOURER'S SCEPTER, it actually gets a really good skill in Surge of Faith. For only 15 FP, you shoot out this massive fire-based AoE attack, and the AoE actually can explode further than you think. And the total damage for this skill is just ridiculous, especially if you do use the follow-up attack for an additional 15 FP. Like this thing can just like melt all different types of enemies in the game. And you also do get a decent amount of hyper armor as well, which honestly might be a downside in some instances, because the obvious and major flaw of this skill is going to be its recovery animations. After you do explode the weapon, you have to sit there for like an additional 3 seconds, waiting for all these little fireballs to come out of the weapon itself. And in that instance, you're getting hit like almost every single time that you use the skill, and it becomes very frustrating, especially because that these little fireballs do like next to no damage, and it's just like a colossal waste of time. Like all the damage is coming from the explosion, and then you just got to get hit and just repeat the process. It definitely would have been a lot more worth it if there was like more fireballs that came out and probably just had like a larger hitbox. But if you do fight these smaller types of enemies, it actually does send them flying and knock them back to the ground. And in that instance, like the recovery frames aren't that big of a deal. But I think that's like the only and major downside of this weapon is just going to be the recovery frames of the skill. And it just makes it a lot more situational than you'd like. But the damage of the weapon, the range of the weapon, and the damage of the skill is just undeniable. And any single time that you're fighting enemies weaker to fire damage, or if you get surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, this thing can just destroy them all instantly. Number 2, the Pickaxe. Now this weapon is basically just like the Rusted Anchor, but just for the great hammers instead. It is an infusible great hammer, and it gets piercing damage, which obviously is just amazing. And yes, every single time that I talk about a pierce damaging weapon, I'm gonna have to glaze it. It's the best damage type in the entire game. A lot of enemies are weaker to it, and if enemies in the middle of an attack combo, you're just gonna be doing bonus damage. And using larger types of weapons that get some nice hyper armor, you can trade out very easily with this thing. Now honestly, for me, I consider this thing just as good as the Rusted Anchor, and some people might even consider it better because it actually does get some more stance damage, and the fact that it is a great hammer, it actually is going to get some more hyper armor as well. Now it's not going to hit as hard as the Rusted Anchor. That one can just get higher amounts of AR and just get higher motion values on charged heavy attacks and whatnot. And I am going to prefer the moveset of the Rusted Anchor a little bit more because it does actually have some more horizontal swipes, whereas a pickaxe is just nothing but downward chops. And this does extend to the heavy attack, which is going to be the lone unique heavy attack that the great hammers do have. And this one actually is faster than the regular great hammers. So it can not only just proc stance breaks faster than all the other great hammers, but it probably can just get the most damage too. Now another unique thing about the pickaxe is that it can't be power stance with great hammers, but it can be power stance with a great axe. And being that you can only get one Rusted Anchor per playthrough, you can go get the pickaxe and put it in the offhand, and you can power stance them both together. And the power stancing great axe and great hammer combo are actually pretty good. So yeah, typically in these instances, one will just end up outclassing the other, but in this case, both the pickaxe and the Rusted Anchor are kind of like just as good as one another. But at number 1, the Great Stars. Now, it does not get the most range nor the most damage by any means compared to all the other infusible Great Hammers, but it does have a few things going for it that it propels it to be like the number 1 option. And that's 1, it is the only Great Hammer that gets passive bleed. 2, it actually gives you health regen on every single hit, which is about 1% HP for every single hit, and this does extend to like really quick types of weapon skills. So using things like Stormcaller or Wild Strikes can proc bleed really quickly and give you a bunch of health regen. And I think the most underrated part about the Great Stars is that you can get 2 in just one playthrough, and they're both pretty early on in the Altus Plateau. And as I mentioned, with Power Ascent and Great Hammers, they get pretty decent and quick movesets. And obviously, you're just going to benefit of a bunch more bleed and a bunch of health regen. Like, there's so many ways that you can build around the Great Stars, whether it be with a heavy infusion with Blood Flame Blade, and a Cult infusion with an Arcane build, or just Power Stancing. Every single one of them is just going to make for an amazing option, and it just makes the Great Stars the best Great Hammer in the game, in my opinion. Anyway, that is all 16 Great Hammers now ranked. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video is going to be the Colossal Weapons, which is like roughly 20 or so of those things, and a lot of them are kind of mid, so it might take a little bit to make, and there might be some amounts of complaining, but definitely do like this video and subscribe for that one, and I'll catch you guys around. Bye!